Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today bringing the recap discussion for the 5th Kaijudo Open that just concluded. So we play these tournaments on the Rangers Dojo Discord group. They're all open format tournaments, which means like everything is legal except bottle, which is restricted. We play with Eye of the Storm, which not everyone's on board with using, but we all kind of play with that set. Some players play more cards than others, but yeah, we got everything legal basically, and a bunch of different interesting decks this time around. So luckily enough, I managed to take this tournament down as well. So had a good performance with Water Nature Aggro, which I brought. And actually, I just posted the profile for this on the channel, but so check that out if you want to see some more in-depth takes on that deck. But Gareth and I both brought it. We both performed pretty well. First and third, Darksigner brought his trusty Waterlight Enforcers deck, finished another really solid performance. I think he's played this deck, I want to say 4 times. I think he had like two second places now, both losing in the finals, and then he also won the finals once, so he has a win in 2 seconds, and then another really solid 2-1 performance as well in a previous tournament. So yeah, he's performed really well with this deck every time he's brought it. Yeah, Gareth and I think we went a combined like 6-1 against the rest of the field. I think I beat him in a match in the winners bracket at one point. So overall 7-2, but when you eliminate that mirror match, 6-1 against everyone else. So we had a pretty good tournament. I think the only loss was of course to Darksigner. I of course beat Darksigner twice. I was his only 2 losses. I beat him in winners finals and grand finals. So got pretty lucky in those matches. I'm not gonna lie. We played 5 games total against each other across both matches. I think the first match, I just drew crazy. I had like hatchery both games. I had first shield artichoke one game. I had second shield artichoke the other. So that was just ridiculous draw. In our finals match, I think one game I just had double hatchery and just drew insane, and then it was pretty easy. The other 2 games were trickier, and I probably played bad in both of them, but I managed to win one of them at least, which is just enough to take the tournament down. Kind of poetic, actually. I think in losers finals, Darksigner and Gareth played a really close match, came down to game 3, and I think the final game, Gareth was going for it with a Boulder Fist, cleared board. Darksigner needed Arbiter and Shields to survive and have the end set up to go for game the next turn if he could dodge Artichoke. He hit the Arbiter, dodged the Artichoke, won the game, and then against me in grand finals, came down to at the first match, game 3, the last game, I also went for Boulder Fist. I needed to dodge Stormspark Blast, and I dodged it and won. So got my poetic revenge. Boulder Fist came in clutch to take down the tournament, so that was nice. And then yeah, for the rest of everything, Loui had a pretty solid performance this time around with a very interesting Glurgle deck. Raijinku finished, and LED both finished pretty solid in 5th place with Water Dark Light and Ranch and Salad Bar, which is basically just a force of veggie deck. And then Claude, new player joining from the IDC kind of Duel Masters server that is run by some of the German Duel Masters guys that Darksigner is a part of in that tournament series. So another Duel Masters player coming over and trying out Kaijudo. Brought a Light Water Dark Panopter list, which is very similar to Hydro Hurricane. A lot of similar ratios to the list he plays over there, if anyone's familiar with that deck. And then we had Andross playing Water Dark Reviled. Claude and Andross actually played a tiebreaker match that Andross won. So technically Claude finished in 8th, Andross in 7th with a 1-2 record. So yeah, that's how the final standing. So very nice feeling to get another tournament win for myself. The bracket, here it is. I had a pretty clean run. Kind of interesting as I actually beat all the players that finished in the top 4. I beat Loui round 1, beat Gareth round 2, and then I played Darksigner twice. And those are all the players that did well. I think Loui only lost to myself and Gareth. So basically all the top 4 players only lost to each other, and then kind of beat everyone else below them, which is kind of interesting how that played out. But yeah, pretty smooth tournament overall for myself and some of these decks as well. So I guess we'll go over the list. So as you may have noticed, like basically everyone brought water, which was kind of interesting. There was a lot of Finbars, basically no dragons, no Andromedas, no Heralds, only the 2 Havens that are in Claude's deck. So Definitely a really weird field this time around. For myself, obviously, I went over this deck in depth playing in a deck profile, but Gareth and I both played this deck, Water Nature Aggro, play the exact same list. Um, yeah, there's a lot of things you could think about. Maybe playing more Shield Blast, maybe playing more early game stuff. I think there wasn't really too much I would change after this tournament experience. Like playing against Darksigner's deck, I felt like it was a really tough matchup, very tricky to play, but we still had enough to be favored. I think in that matchup overall, even without the extra Shield Blast. So maybe you can make an argument you don't actually need them. Like it would be a good comfort pick. Like it makes you give you more confidence in the matchup if you have those Shield Blasts, but they may not be necessary. I think. Like you can play without that comfort to improve other matchups, and I would like to have those extra Rusalkas and everything else, and the more consistent early game instead of Shield Blast to be a little bit better positioned against good control decks, which I didn't really play in this tournament, so I don't have a great measuring stick yet for how those matchups play out and how much I really need. So, but after this tournament, I don't think I would change much. Boulder Fist was pretty clutch at different points. Gives you a really nice option. I really like that one of, which so credit to Gareth for putting his foot down to play that card as our one of. The 3 Rusalka, I really like the full 6 Rusalka package. I think it's really fun to play with and really potent. So I don't know if I would change too much. You could trim evolutions, maybe trim an early game card. I don't know. You can mess around with some of the numbers, maybe move away from Artichoke. It'd be nice to have 1 extra water mana, because sometimes like in matchups where the water cards are really important, it could definitely be nice to have more, especially because like you're ramping, like especially with Toadstool draws, and you want to go like, there are a lot of matchups where I wanted to go Toadstool into Rusalka, and when you're trying to do that, especially on the play, your mana sources might be a little sketchy for playing like these on 3 with only 12 water. Like it's good enough, I think, but when you want, especially when you want to be playing multiples of these cards, like if you want to go Toadstool into Rusalka into Cephalia, you're asking for a lot more water mana than your deck can really produce. So I think it would be nice to have a few more sources, I think, but it's hard to fit that with also like the many tribes early game stuff. And so I could see trimming an evolution for like a Cryo Nucleus or something like that. Maybe like trim I don't know. It's just, I really like all the cards in the deck. Maybe I play like 2 Artichokes and 1 Cryo Nucleus or something weird like that. But yeah, I could definitely see wanting more water mana and more Shield Blast. But yeah, I don't know. Overall, the deck performed pretty well for both Gareth and I, so not too much to say from this tournament. But yeah, if you want more in-depth look at things, definitely check out the video I posted. So next up we have Loui's Waterfire Glurgle deck. This is really, I mean, a really spicy deck. I did not expect this. Loui usually brings like darkness mid-rangey piles, and this time around 40 cards, water, mono water, basically aggro deck, splashing some fire stuff. This deck, I think, unfortunately, the Glurgle stuff I don't think really pans out. The idea, I guess, is to have this combo element where you have like Glurgle 2.0 filling your hand up, and then obviously dropping Aeronaut for free and just spamming the board, and then you can mix in some Queen Rusalkas to like maybe pick up your 2.0s, pick up your Aeronauts, and play them again for free as like a free bait. But the problem is Queen Rusalkas just it didn't. I played a lot of games with this deck, probably more than I should admit, in testing and everything like that, just messing around, getting a feel for other people's decks and how they function. And I really felt like Queen Rusalka was basically dead. It never really did anything. I think in some of the control matchups it could be decent, right? Just having that, picking up some cards to reuse their ETBs could be nice as a value play, but there's not a lot of really great value stuff you can do with it. Like you can pick up traders, I guess. You can pick up Reef Prince, but that's a little slow. And like the unblockable body is good against some of the decks in this field. Like the big body is pretty good, but it just felt like it was really mainly just a water mana. And then Aeronaut Glurgle was another card that just, unfortunately, I just never lived the dream. Like I don't think it ever came up really as a Shield Blast. It never really came up as a card from hand. Like very, very rarely was it ever actually used for its effect, unfortunately. I just think it was too hard. I think the 2.0 Dream just doesn't really pan out really the way you want it to. It just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't work. Like you just don't draw enough cards like with this list. Like you draw 1, 2 usually. Very rarely do you draw 3 or 4. And it's a fine card. Like it ends up being, basically what I ended up coming away from with this deck is that it basically just plays as like a kind of clunky mono water deck where your best draws are just like chaining cheap stuff into Neuron, and then Hovercraft being surprisingly effective is just like protecting your evolutions, and like your best setups were just like 2 drops and Neuron, and then beating down and protecting them with Hovercraft, getting them low life total, and then it makes it tough for them to answer the Neuron because it comes back, you replay it next turn, just keep chaining stuff. And then you could even protect your Neuron with Cyber Sprite, so that card just like chump blocks, you can easily deploy it next turn, which is more mana efficient than just like letting your Neuron die and replaying that. So like those were the best setups with the deck. And the problem is like the rest of your deck is just kind of non-functional, like water mana. Like Queen Rusalka is just always a charge, Aeronaut's always a charge, Reef Prince and Potato Gun, like these were effectively like they're just really slow. Like Reef Prince is very slow, worse than like Cephalia by a huge margin basically. Potato Gun, basically just you would play it as like a vanilla 4-drop effectively. Like it has some niche applications I guess, but basically just like if you need something to fill your curve you could play this, but it's basically just like a draft card almost, like has very little use. So it's like just another card. Like if this was like a Rusalka, your deck would be a lot better. So yeah, I think it ends up playing like just a clunky mono water deck where if you draw the mono water aggro half of your deck, you can have some really good starts. But the problem is your top decks are kind of bad because you're playing a bunch of bad cards, and your opening hands can be high variance because you need to draw like the good half of your deck to win, and then like, or draw enough of it, and then hope you just like don't draw too much of the bad half so that you can have a functional game. So it just makes it a little bit inconsistent because the Glurgle 2.0 half of the deck doesn't really function. Although Glurgle 2.0 was a fine card in its own right, just for the deck, just being an evolution, even though it's probably worse than like if you just play Dendrite or something like that. This card just being a fast attack body that draws you at least a couple cards, which just means you can have more field to charge so you can land a Finbar. Like that was just fine. Like it just, even if you're just drawing cards, even if they're bad, was kind of okay. So yeah, that was basically the plan of the deck and how I felt like it. I guess it's just really hard to manage because I just feel like there's no like equilibrium point, because this deck, to me, it already feels like you're playing like the bare minimum of like just generic good cards, right? And then you're just hoping that this is like the bare minimum of like Glurgle stuff that you have to play to have a functional Aeronaut deck. But the problem is, in practice, I think it is below the minimum to have a functional Aeronaut deck. Like you need to play more to make that element functional, and the problem is playing more takes away, and now you can't be at the minimum of functional like just generic good stuff. So adding more Glurgles means you're taking away the generic good stuff, and now you have like just a bad Glurgle deck where it's just like a pile of Glurgle synergy cards, and it just is a non-functional deck overall. So you have to hope like the equilibrium point in this deck is at a place where you can play enough Glurgle stuff to get the good value out of the Glurgle engine while still having enough good stuff cards to staple that all together into a overall good package. And the problem is like that point I don't think exists. Like it unfortunately, like you're playing like the maximum Glurgle cards you can really afford probably, and the deck is just like not, and it doesn't really function. Like you could maybe squeeze in a bit more. I think one of the things was the Queen Rusalka. To me, it looked like this card was just accidentally put in instead of Dragon Engine, and it turned out to be kind of the opposite, where Loui had initially played Dragon Engine, which is why there's the fire cards in this deck in the first place, but he decided to just kind of swap it out for Queen Rusalka because he felt like Dragon Engine just didn't perform. It was too clunky, which, I mean, I'll give him credit for figuring that out. I think the card is really powerful, and I would have a hard time buying that it wasn't good, but I mean, I guess like I would probably rather cut Flamespitter than the Dragon Engine and then just find a different fire card if you're worried about the multi-sif count, but I'm not sure. Like it felt like you needed a few more Glurgles, and it felt like Dragon Engine was one of the more powerful cards you could even play if you are choosing to play fire. But yeah, so it ended up being a little bit disjointed, where now the fire section is kind of a little bit small, basically just splashing some shield blasts and the flame spitters kind of randomly, so it looks a little bit disjointed. But yeah, overall, I mean, in the tournament, the deck did perform well, because I think Loui, I mean, he had a good time drawing the good half of his deck. I think when you do draw the, like against Andross, for example, in his first losers match, he just, from what I hear, he had the good aggro draw, like just swarmed at Andross, got ahead on the front foot, had the Neurons, had the Hovercraft to protect it. And in that matchup against Andross, that's really effective, because Andross, he's playing a Water Dark Revile deck, which I'll show just really quickly here. Like, I mean, you're just spamming evolutions, but if you're caught on the back foot, you're relying on using those evolutions to answer your opponent's board because you don't have a lot of other interaction, just a soul reflection. And the problem is hovercraft just makes that really untenable, because then now you can't answer the neuron really anymore unless you find those soul vortex, and that means your opponent just keeps chaining neurons every turn and you just lose. So that aspect of the deck seemed to function pretty well, and that was also the scary aspect from my testing when I was playing with the Water Nature deck, is just the best draws that Loui can have were just drawing probably more of the aggro side of his deck than he really should in kind of theory, where you just, I mean, again, you have the cheap curve, you have neurons, and then you have hovercraft, and then one of your actual super important cards was Cyber Sprite, just because it pairs so well with hovercraft to protect your other stuff. It protects your attackers, and you can just easily redeploy it. So just having hovercraft plus 1 mana blocker to protect your neurons and stuff was just really crucial. So those were the best draws, but they're just a little too inconsistent with this build. So I think you could definitely keep hovercraft if you're going for this kind of deck, and then just, yeah, unfortunately I think you just probably swap the fire cards for a different package, and then just move away from some of the other stuff. But overall, I mean, Loui had finished 4th place with it, because I think the good part of the deck is still pretty solid, and then you just kind of concede to the fact that some of the combo engine just didn't really end up panning out. But I don't know, like Loui predicted himself to go 0-2 and just have a hard time for the tournament, but ended up, I mean, getting a couple wins. So definitely overperformed his expectations at the end of things. So the next list was Claude's, as I kind of mentioned earlier, his Light Water Dark Panopter deck. So very inspired by the Hydra Hurricane Lace that he obviously plays a lot in Duel Masters. I don't think Claude's ever played Fire Nature to my knowledge. I don't think those civs exist to him. He just purely plays Light Water Dark. This list, I think, pretty solid. It just plays a lot of good stuff cards. I mean, cheap interaction, keeper laws. The problem is not having Hydra Hurricane is such a big it just changes everything. Because the problem is this kind of strategy, like Panopter just feels a bit underpowered. Like you have your good draws, you chain 1 or 2 of these together, just start building a huge blocker wall. But your opponent can play through that. There's a bunch of stuff that plays through it. They can deal with Panopter pretty easily. And you don't have that like win button. Like not having Hydra Hurricane means like you're just so much weaker to anything your opponent can do to counter you. Like they just get to keep building up their own board. Like cards like Storm Spark become way more scary because they can just eventually build up a board and Storm Spark you and then just kill you or kill your board. Whereas like in Duel Masters, all these counter cards your opponent can play, you have this like really cheap win condition card like Hydra Hurricane where you just gain a bit of traction and then you just land a Hurricane and then you kind of just win for the most part. Not necessarily, but it really does take your opponent off the ability to get to the cards that actually do beat you or would be really threatening to your position. Otherwise, like in Kaijudo, like they're just going to play some big creatures and then just push through your blocker wall eventually. So you do actually need something to be that unfair card to go over the top. It could be Andromeda or it could be Eternal Haven like Claude chose. You do need a card like that that just kind of invalidates what your opponent's doing and gives you that kind of win condition card. But it's just, those cards just aren't the same as Hydra Hurricane. Like they're just so much more expensive. It gives your opponent so much more time to play through your setups, interact with it, to destroy it, whatever, however you want to go about it. Like it just gives your opponent so much more time when you have to get to a 9 or 10 mana card compared to a 6 mana card that just, again, like Hydra Hurricane, you just drop it, set your opponent back a ton, then you get to develop your Panopter setups even more. You get the time to maybe in Kaijudo land a win condition card like Eternal Haven or Andromeda that you might still need, but it just completely changes it. And so like banking on Haven to be the card that kind of bails you out, it's a little too expensive, unfortunately. So I actually helped Claude a little bit preparing for this tournament. We had a testing session where we played a bunch of games, and while we were doing that, sort of in the back of my mind, I was just keeping track of how many games I would have just lost to a Hydra Hurricane, and there were basically points in pretty much every single game we played where I was thinking to myself, if he just had Hydra Hurricane here, I'd probably just lose the game outright. But instead, I mean, I would just have plenty of opportunity to come back and play through. Like there were so many times, like, I mean, if you fall behind to a Panopter, gets out a couple creatures, it's not a big deal. You get the time to play through and break that board with some cards, like something like a Blinder Beetle Prime for other decks, or just setting up a creature, Piercing, Judgmenting, Finbar bouncing. Just playing through it is so much easier when you don't have to worry about just being set back 3 or 4 mana in chunks, or just your opponent even just landing a, or when you get into like those board stalls where one player's got a board full of blockers, you've got a board full of creatures, you're just waiting for that Storm Spark or whatever, and you just, when a card like Hydra Hurricane's out there, you just risk like just losing on the spot to just some pretty easy to cast card that just sets you to 0 mana, and now all of a sudden like there's you don't have those outs anymore basically. So again, pretty much every game there was an opportunity where that card would beat you, and just not having that tool, it just completely changes the deck in my opinion. It makes a lot of the whole engine weaker essentially. I felt like this deck had a bit too hard of a time like kind of turning the corner and really stabilizing, and relied a little bit too heavily on Panopter just to like build the block, because you kind of needed the block wall to do anything without as many shield blasts. Like, I mean, he went up to 10 when I was initially playing with him. He didn't have the Bone Blades, but even then, like, the shield blast counts are a little weird, more reminiscent of like the kind of Hydra Hurricane list that Claude plays in Duel Masters. I think not having more Terra Pits definitely came back to bite him in his matchup against Andross, for example. Like, Andross chaining Vicious Squilla Scourges, like giant unblockable creature, is basically a death sentence for this deck. Like, if you can't scrounge up enough attackers or like find your one of Sky Shark to like quickly kill your opponent, like you have like no answers for Vicious Squillas outside of the one Terra Pit. Basically, you're just like trying to bounce it with your few bounces and just like tempo them out somehow. So yeah, that card is a huge problem, and just not having enough hard answers was difficult. So you're leaning maybe a bit harder on your discard cards. So I don't know. Overall, I felt like the deck was pretty decently positioned for the field, because there are a lot of kind of like more mediocre aggro decks. But I mean, like Loui randomly has a ton of unblockable stuff. Andross has a bunch of unblockable stuff. So I thought it was pretty good, well positioned at first, but it ended up playing out pretty poorly for Claude overall results wise. Maybe some of that was inexperience in playing, but at the same time, like, I think maybe I overestimated as well just how well positioned his deck was actually for the field. But yeah, decent. Like, I like a lot of the choices, but I think overall, like, personally, I think Panopter strategies are a little bit flawed. They just don't function too well against, especially top tier stuff. Like, I think they're good against, like, if the good decks that this deck would be good against are like a lot of the more linear aggro side of things. If you're playing against a lot of the interaction heavy aggro tempo decks, dragon decks, mid range, like other stuff, like I think Panopter ends up being a pretty fragile card. So like against BBP decks, you're really leaning on your discard super hard. Otherwise, that card like wrecks you. Piercing plus like Herald obviously destroys you. Like, yeah, it's just a little bit weak to the top tier stuff in Kaijudo, I think. But pretty solid deck overall, though. But yeah, didn't end up working out too well in the tournament. Next up, we have Andross's Reviled list. So this list, very cool that he's been working on for a while. I know he's had different builds and was working on it a bit leading up to the tournament, just picking through some card choices. I messed around with some builds of this deck. I know Darksigner also messed around with some builds with this deck. I think it's a bit underpowered, obviously, but it has some cool synergy stuff going for it. You're basically just trying to fill your graveyard, drop a Reviled, and then start like chaining evolutions or other plays. You have like Master of the Graves as another graveyard payoff, trying that out from Eye of the Storm. Just set up your graveyard with a Spy Tide and then play Master of the Graves. You got Vicious Coffer to fill your graveyard, develop a creature. Overall, I felt like the deck was decent, but it's just a little bit slow, a little bit clunky. Your setup's a little bit, it's just a little weak, I think, overall. But it was a good build for what it is. I think I know there are some changes Andross wanted to make. For example, like moving away from Cyberscamp. Like, it's definitely just a good card against control, but it ups the water count. I think like having a higher dark count, focusing more on Scavenging Chimera, or just having more Chimera baits in general for your Reviled. Like, you can, and Skolas is like just more Chimera 2-drops would be nice, like Gigazonda, or even just playing other graveyard synergy stuff like Baleful Drummer kind of, and then maybe moving away from Master of the Graves, going to Underworld Stalker. Master of the Graves felt really good when you're going, or not even really good, but felt much better going first, where you could like have your best draws of like 2-drop into Vicious Coffer and a Master of the Graves, and then put your opponent on the back foot. But going second, especially, it was just way too slow. Going first, even like your opponent just responds with a Rusalka, and then it just felt like too slow of a card, a little bit too hopeful. That said, Underworld Stalker also a very slow card, but it just felt like maybe a little bit more synergistic, works with more stuff in the deck, gets you a better value card, better against control, I guess. So I could definitely see arguments for Honorable Stalker being better, but trying Master of the Graves, it was okay, I think, but not that great. The rest of the deck, I mean, most of it's pretty full. Like I said, you could swap scamps for like Baleful Drummers, Sickly Larvas, Gigazondas, like random other 2-drop options. I like the third Scavenging because you can set it up. You can play your opening hand in ways where you can set this up. It works a bit against Reviled, where you're picking up cards from your graveyard, or against Master of the Graves in particular, where you're picking up the cards that you're putting in that you need. But I think it was just like a nice value card, cheap bait, can get up to 3k, even if you don't have the water, even if it's not turned on. Like, you still have the option of just like a 2-mana Chimera bait, which is nice. So I like that card choice. But yeah, overall the deck, I mean, Soul Reflection felt pretty good actually. Like, just reasonable Shield Blast, cool with the deck. It was castable where you don't have much else in the way of interaction. It was kind of nice to have like a 5-mana castable card, even though it's a bit medium, but that card performed pretty well. Spy Tide's fun to play with. Warp Sea Ray was nice as well, just an extra addition from Eye of the Storm, where you have another corrupted card, another untapped mana. And then this one, being a Shield Blast creature, is really nice. Just ups your Shield Blast count without having to play. Like, it's cool that your Shield Blasts are just like pretty on plan, and you don't have to just splash like random stuff like Terror Pit, I guess. But yeah, some of the cards like Squillis came up clutch in the match against Claude, but I mean, Andross, he played against Gareth, and Gareth, I think Gareth definitely missed a guaranteed lethal line in one of the games that he could have won, and then Andross took that one, and then game 3 ended up actually being super close, where Andross had like one of the god mills of like, I think he played a Vicious Coffer or something and milled like 3 corrupted, so he was able to play like 1-drop plus Reviled on, or he was able to play a Reviled on turn 4, which is like pretty crazy, and then was able to get out ahead going that direction, but Gareth had just enough to stabilize and take the game eventually. So he had a close matchup there in the first round against Gareth, and then ended up losing to Loui. But then again, like as I covered, just backfooting against that deck, it's a little bit hard when you don't have the Shield Blast come up for you. So yeah, I don't know. I think overall pretty solid. Some of the changes, like maybe Gloom Tomb, felt medium, but that was only because we were playing against a lot of aggro decks, so could still be good if you're going against more slow stuff to find your reviles and reuse them. Cyber Scamp, I think, has merit, but I think could be better cards. I think one of the things too is like with all the self mill, it kind of hurts Cyber Scamp. Like if you play this turn 2 and then play and then you play a Vicious Coffer, the Vicious Coffer effect kind of takes away like some percent of like the effectiveness of Cyber Scamp when you play it. So that's something to consider, I guess. But yeah, overall the deck pretty solid. So and it did well. I know Andross was kind of happy to get that game off Gareth. He was kind of happy to get the win against Claude as well, and like show that like the deck, I think, as most would see, it is a bit underpowered, a little bit clunky, but it can do some cool stuff for sure. Reviled is definitely a fun card to play with, especially if we get out 2 of them. You can do some crazy stuff. But next deck we have LED bringing his patented veggie deck. This time, I think he called it Ranch Salad Bar. I can only imagine the ranch salad reference is like the light cards, which I guess is the ranch dressing. Personally, I would do without the dressing, just like in real life. I don't think it adds too much, and I think it just makes the deck a little bit clunkier. I preferred LED's older builds where he just had like just pure water nature splashing a little bit of fire. I think the light cards don't really do too much, especially when you, I mean, yeah, I think they're just like worse than the fire cards, and it's a lot to ask to put both packages in your deck. Like Stalker Sphere is probably, it just takes too much setup, right? Like it's just too vulnerable. It's turns your position into a bit too much of like a house of cards, a little too fragile, a little bit too difficult to put together. You need like your Stalker Sphere and your Fallen Keeper, and then you probably need like Seneschal 2 to protect against piercing. Like it's just weak to a lot of stuff. There are some matchups where I guess it's pretty good, but like overall, like even Fallen Keeper works against some of like the Durian setups that you might have. Like if you have like Durian or Ninja Pumpkin plus Bad Apple, and you've like regen them, especially like now all of a sudden like Fallen Keepers are like working against your plan, and then yeah, it just I don't think it adds much. I think it just makes the deck a little bit too clunky, like especially like turning your Aqua Tricksters, which are just like a nice consistent early game card, untap water mana, turning that into Fallen Keeper, which is just like an inconsistent 3-drop, I think just hurts the deck, basically. And I felt like that came to pass in the tournament. Like I think Gareth and LED played, and I think one of the games was just a clunky opening hand where LED basically missed his 2-drop and wasn't able to play it until turn 3, and then just because of like the opening mana sequence, and that put him pretty far behind. So I think things like that just come up where I don't think the light adds anything. I do like the Ninja, like I like the Ninja Pumpkin Field Marshal package. Like I like playing more. I know Darksigner's not as much of a fan of it when he plays Regen, but personally I like the extra power. I like playing 3 copies of Regeneration, but LED's not as much of a fan of that access to the deck, I guess. But like I like the Veggie package. I think it's pretty strong. Gives a little bit more staying power to the deck. But I think it's just the other flex slots. Like you could look for more consistency cards. You can look for a higher Shield Blast count. Definitely adding the Aqua Tricksters back in as like just a more consistent early game card. I would look to spend the flex slots a little bit differently, but everything else is pretty reminiscent of like LED's initial Veggie builds, which I worked off of, and Darksigner worked off of as well. So I think, I think the experiment with the dressing just didn't really pan out too much. I know LED, I mean, he got his win against Claude, where I think maybe some inexperience cost Claude. As you mentioned, like he wasn't familiar with the Veggie combo, and if you're not familiar, like this deck is really tricky to play against if you don't know what's going on. Like it's very explosive, and I think Claude mentioned it, I think in game 3, like there was a turn where he could have cleared board and prevented like the combo setup, but he decided to develop some stuff instead, and then like just got completely punished because it just gave LED the ability to combo off. And then so yeah, he got that match. But yeah, like I mentioned, like against like the aggro deck out of Gareth's hands, Gareth was able to just, I mean, the more consistent aggro deck just kind of got underneath him, and the clunkiness kind of came back to bite him. And then against Raijinku, I think that was another matchup where maybe the clunkiness, like just you could have some good setups, but when you're already playing this like Ninja Pumpkin Field Marshal package, so you're a bit clunky in the face of like discard and Shield Blast, a bit high cost. So when you move away from like the extra early game, it just makes those matchups a little bit trickier when you don't have the full 3 Swift Regenerations and stuff like that. When you have the clunkier stuff like the light cards, I think that probably hurts your matchup against the control stuff for sure. And I think it, like that's the problem, is like you're probably playing these cards because they help against aggro, right? You got your Full Metal Lemons as blockers, the Soccer Spheres, and the Fallen Keepers. Like these have applications mainly just in the aggro matchups. But the problem is like I just feel like they're detrimental in the aggro matchups. Like more so than they are beneficial, just because they make the rest of your deck clunkier, and you can have a decent game against aggro decks if you just focus on like if you just add some Shield Blasts and just like emphasize the main strategy of the deck more. So yeah, Charizard's a good card. You can just basically just use it to cheese some wins, I guess. Like I haven't really played with this card much, but you just drop it on a Corrupted, just Alpha Strike them or kill their whole board. Like it can be very powerful in that direction, but so I don't mind it. Like I know it, like Water Fire mana can be nice, but I don't know if I would spend a multi-civ on this card. I think especially when you're already playing like the Field Marshal Ninja Pumpkin package, I don't think you need another card like that. That's just like one of these like expensive kind of situational stuff. I would just like emphasize more of the consistent package. But again, like this overall good deck I think the core is like pretty solid. Just like the Corrupted Veggie stuff, I think those decks are pretty reasonable. Like I don't think they're super strong, especially in open format, but they definitely have a place. And I just think the experiment of the salad dressing was not maybe not the best way to spend the flex slots, but still decent deck. So the last one, I mean, we got Darksigner. Might as well go over it pretty quick. Just Darksigner's Light Water Enforcer deck, staple of Darksigner. Played it in 4 tournaments so far, done well in pretty much every one. Just the 2 changes that he made were, I mean, the cuts from the last tournament where he played this deck, where he won. He mentioned wanting to cut the Cephalia for Keeper, Laws, and Rusalka, which he did, added the 3rd copy of each. And then the other thing was just changing the early game stuff, went for 3 Spark Drones. instead of Cloudwalker drones, which, I mean, I think in the tournament he said kind of played out poorly. Like, I think in some of the matches against me and Gareth where we were playing Charbala Hatchery, there were multiple times where he had Spark Drone into Blinder Beetle and had to trade, rather than if it was Cloudwalker drone would have got to kill it for free. But so yeah, there's some trade-offs to all these cards. Cloudwalker drone can like lose to certain things a little bit harder. For example, like Kyo randomly, like if you break, I don't know, it doesn't really matter that much, I guess, because like if you go Kyo, like Cloudwalker drone plus another enforcer bait, like a cheap thing like Luminous, like if you break one shield, like the Kyo can come down, kill the Luminous, and then it can attack over the Cloudwalker, whereas like Spark Drone's gonna at least trade with that Kyo, I guess. Like, so there are some niche situations, but overall, personally, I'm a fan of the Cloudwalker drone. But it's nice to give another try. I know Darksigner's tried a lot of different early game cards, whether it's like Magris, Sky Voltmech, even Aqua Strider in the past before some of these tournaments. Like, there's a lot of different things you could try. So just gave it a shot to Spark Drone. I don't know if he would stick with it going forward, but yeah, that is Darksigner's deck. And the last one is a very interesting build from Raijinku, which is this like Shield Blast Control Kalima deck. It's hard to say if this is really, I mean, I don't even know if I would necessarily call this a Kalima deck anymore. I think you could call it like a Shield Blast Control deck almost. Like, it's definitely got a completely different game plan where you are really focused on a super high Shield Blast count. Obviously, we've got a crazy amount of them, like Jokos, Lethal Lockbox, Arbiter, Repulse, and then down here, like, there's just a ton. There's just a ton of Shield Blast, and then obviously the other big notable thing is these recharges, which is really interesting card you don't see played very often. Repulse, which is a pretty quality card, but also another shield regeneration card. And then Andromeda's obviously is the big haymaker everyone's familiar with, and then to an extent you have Serpents as well. So it's just playing a ton of shield regeneration and a ton of Shield Blast, which is a really interesting approach. And then it's just kind of choosing to use Kalima as a pretty good finisher. I mean, just a solid card. It's not at its best here, right? You're not... Unfortunately, I think you're going to mill one darkness card a lot more than you like. Very often it's going to be 2. You're not really going to hit the highs of 3 cards very often. So the card is not at its best here, but it's still just a giant body that kills a thing or two when it enters, which is pretty good. And then the Dark Return effect you can make pretty good use out of as well, right? Because you're milling your deck, that might help you hit stuff like Andromedas or other things like that. And then you have a lot of tap effects in this deck as well, which you can take advantage of to get that Queen Kalima effect off. Maybe start chaining them together. So it still does a good job as a finisher card. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting list. The other really notable thing, I mean, you've got Reverberate, which is a great card advantage spell, and plays really nicely with this deck too, because obviously when you're deck full of Shield Blast, your opponents incentivize a little bit more to manage how they go into your shields, which means Reverberate can have a lot of value there because they're playing a little more passively, and then the Reverberate's going to draw a ton of cards and set you up for the rest of the game, so that's pretty interesting. And then the other really cool thing is the Veil Slip package, which we haven't seen used yet in tournaments, but Veil Slip plus Black Feather, which is a really cool combination where you can set this up, and then ideally, obviously, you mill a big creature. You've got a lot of them in the deck with, like, even Serpents would count as, like, a big creature for sure. So very often if you mill, like, a Serpents or anything bigger, you're going to wrath their whole board, and that definitely really strong, catches you up. And then with Veil Slip, the way it works as well is the Black Feather ends up back in your hand when the trigger goes off from Soul Devourer. So it ends up being really interesting where you can just... The Veil Slip turns into the effect, which is good enough, and then Soul Devourer you get for even a later turn, so you can use it again a few turns later, which is really interesting. So definitely very cool. Although it interacts like weirdly with Cyber Scamp because if your opponent attacks on their turn and you hit Veil Slip plus Soul Devourer, it works out in your favor because the Veil Slip resolves first, and then they search with Scamp, and then you wrath them with the Soul Devourer. So if they hit Veil Slip as a trigger, then it kills your whole board. But obviously, if you do it on your turn, that won't work out. Unfortunately, it won't. They won't search with Scamp until after the Black Feather trigger. So kind of similar to how most Shield Blast sweeper effects work against Cyber Scamp, where it can't always clear the whole board. But unlike something like Drill Storm or Tendril, which also doesn't clear Scamp when they're attacking, it has a benefit of clearing it when they attack your shields. So that is actually really clutch, I think, a lot of the time. So but yeah, that package really interesting, helps a lot for catch up, and then lets you land your shield regeneration. But I think there are some issues with the deck. I think it could definitely be optimized a bit more for sure. I think it's a risky kind of, I don't know, it feels like a bit of a flawed strategy overall in actual practice. At least with this, yeah, just like trying to shield regeneration and then just answer everything with shield blast. I don't think it really ends up working out too well, because like if you look at like a normal deck, like a more traditional pile control deck where you have blockers and interaction that you're casting from hand, you're playing ramp spells, doing your own kind of proactive game plan, and when you're playing a deck like that, I mean, you only need like very often it could be like having 1 or 2 shield blasts will win you the game, and that'll be the difference against an aggro deck. And that's because you're pairing those shield blasts with cards that you're playing from hand. Whereas this deck, if you look at the kind of curve, I mean, you really don't have that much that's interacting with your opponent that you're casting from hand. I mean, you have only the set of 3 2-drops, which is Spectre Claw, which is kind of a bit iffy. You have Mesmerize, which is a great card, but that's your only 3-drop, and you're just 3 in a 52 card deck is asking a lot to see that consistently. And then you have your Spire Puppets and to an extent Underworld Stalker, but that's really easy to interact with very often unless you had a bunch of discard. But yeah, there's just not a lot of interaction coming out of your hand. So what ends up happening is, rather than being one of those decks that's just asking for 1 or 2 shield blasts, you end up being a deck that, like this deck, unfortunately, it relies on having a shield blast at pretty much every point in order to make plays, because those other decks, once again, they're making plays, and then the shield blasts are gravy that just puts them over the top. Whereas this deck, you need those shield blasts to be able to make plays in the first place. So instead of being a deck that's just asking for 1 or 2 blasts, maybe just 1 to swing a game in their favor, this deck is asking for 4 or 5 shield blasts. And yeah, you're raising your shield blast count, so it's pretty likely you're going to have like 3 plus or something. I haven't run the numbers, but it's pretty likely you're going to see a decent number of blasts, but you're asking for, very often you're asking for even more than what's reasonable to expect out of this deck. I feel that's kind of my sense that I got from playing it, is you're just asking a little bit too much when you don't have the plays to make out of hand. And that's the problem with kind of balancing this strategy as well, is because you want to balance like the shield trigger aspect, being full of shield triggers, and you also want to balance having, but it's hard to balance that with like also having the shield regeneration cards, and also having like the interaction cards, and also having the win conditions and card advantage stuff to function. It's just really hard to fit everything while just maintaining that high shield blast count, unfortunately. So I think that's kind of what makes it a little bit of a flawed approach, or a flawed strategy, but because it's just very, very hard to gain traction, unfortunately. Like it's just hard to gain traction unless you just like literally have a shield blast at every single point, and even then, depending on the deck your opponent's playing, yeah, it just is a little flawed. Or you're basically asking to just draw way more early discard spells, your early interaction, than you should reasonably expect to, which is sort of the sense I got from the deck. I think there are definitely some card choices you can change, like playing the deck. I did play a fair amount with this deck, to be honest, probably more than I should have, but Ground Manipulator and Serpents really didn't feel, I feel like those were kind of relics of the initial versions of this deck that Raijinku was testing. I played a little bit against him on a few variants of Kalima, and it felt like when you had more of the Slayer package and a little more cheap creatures, blockers, and stuff like that, these cards are higher value, Serpents and Agrics, and the way the deck ended up developing, I feel like they're kind of just, like Serpents can be okay at times. Like, for example, your opponent hits an Arbiter. This deck doesn't leverage Arbiter that well. It's a fine shield blast, but I mean, that's another problem too, is like your Arbiters aren't created equal. Like an Arbiter in Darksigner's deck is worth a lot more than an Arbiter in Raijinku's deck when it's broken as a shield. So very often, partly because of the game plans and all that, and just the way you can leverage Arbiter in the first place. So yeah, so this deck, I mean, it gives you a way to like your opponent breaks some of these shield blast creatures and you drop a Serpents and get a few shields. It works well with Joko, obviously, but I feel like Serpents was just a little inconsistent. But it does help with the mana count. You need some light dark multis, but maybe I would pick another cheap card rather than Serpents. I think that might be a direction I go. Although there's also tension when you do that with the Black Feathers, where you want to have that high count, which is another point of variance. Is I felt like because the deck struggles to gain traction, you're really banking. I felt like when I was playing this deck, a lot of it came down to trying to assemble this 2-card combo of Veil Slit plus Black Feather. And since that's such an important access to the deck, it's hard to justify like trimming some of these big creatures because it makes that card even more inconsistent. And there were a lot of games that came down to like getting good mills off Blackfeather, and if you just whiff, which is not that unlikely, like it'll happen pretty like one in every 2 or 3 times, like it's not that unlikely, and you're gonna whiff. And then when you're banking on that kind of variance, I think that's a little bit of the problem with this deck, is just banking on a little too much variance. But I mean, it's still a powerful combination, but it's another demanding card, which is kind of an issue. But I could see emphasizing that package a little bit more. I think changing the mana base a little bit, like the water section, when you want to be casting your Veil Slip, you also want to be casting your Reverberate. You probably want a little bit more water mana, which doing all that makes Kalima worse. So you probably want to find another big creature to play instead of Kalima. Unfortunately, I think you could definitely go for... I mean, you could pick anything. You could pick Tritonus, which may be a little medium. You could pick Eternal Haven. You probably want, again, you want some big stuff that you can mill off Blackfeather at that point, but I don't know. Kalima's still fine. Like, you could just play it as a giant beatstick triple breaker, but I think there's better options. You could go a direction where you go on high counts of Schoolless Scourge. You could do that instead, like just play a few Kalimas. Maybe, I think Mark of Kalima is another card that could get cut for sure. Even if you do choose to still play Kalima, I think there's better dark cards. Just lowering the curve, I think you want to you just want more cheap cards in this deck, I think. A little more consistent interaction to pair with it, because it's not enough to have those Shield Blasts. So there's a lot of things you could change. Like if you add more cheap stuff, you could keep the Agrics or even bump up the numbers on Agrics maybe, and then build a little more around that. I don't know. It's hard to digest everything, right? Like you could definitely add more Shield Blast blockers, Den Gorgers and Ichor Spiders, or what, I forget the name exactly. I think that might be right, but I don't know. There's a lot of things. I think this deck type definitely has a lot of potential, but I feel like this was a little bit of a rough first draft. But yeah, overall, I mean, the card count issue, like it's 52 cards, which is a lot, and definitely that's like more of an argument to find. I think that's why you want to make concessions for cheap cards like those Shield Blast blockers. I think those have a lot of value because they do lower your curve. Because I totally understand, like I have problems with playing, like relying on Mesmerize when you're playing a high card count like this. Like, and you don't, like it's fine when you have other cheap plays, which is what I'm getting to. It's fine when you have like other cheap plays, but when your only cheap play is Mesmerize, you're leaning way too hard on it, and you're just not going to see it consistently. So at the same time, you can't really thin this deck to 40 cards. Like you need to maintain the ratio of like, you need to play a hard card count so you can have your shield regeneration, you can have your high density of Shield Blast, and so you can have your enough of a density of late game stuff. So you have to manage all that, which means you're going to have a high card count. So you can't make you can't address the Mesmerize issue by slimming to 40 cards. You address it by lowering the curve, and I think that's where you cut the Serpents, you cut the Mark of Kalimas, you change up some of your stuff. I don't know. Like there's a lot of directions you could go, but yeah, overall I think a lot of it is pretty strong, but yeah, in playing the deck, it felt like it was a little too weak to some stuff, like a little too reliant on a little more luck than it should mathematically have, I guess, and then leaning really hard on assembling this 2-card combo in a deck that was only playing 2 copies of each. It felt like, and maybe you don't have to lean into the combo. I think it was only, maybe that's like, you don't need to lean more into it. It's mainly just, you had to lean into it with this specific build because you didn't have the other cheap stuff to accommodate the rest of the deck, I guess. But overall, I think definitely a very interesting approach, but yeah, I think could definitely use a little bit of a little bit more tuning. But yeah, I think valuable experience in this tournament for Raijinku with that list. So yeah, that is all the decks from this Kaijudo Open. So once again, thanks to everyone for playing. It was a pretty fun tournament. Congrats to Darksigner for another good result. I mean, first, second, and then with this deck so far, I think pretty well. And Gareth did pretty well with Water Nature once again. Congrats to everyone else. Like, big thanks to everyone for playing. It was another fun tournament. If you're interested in getting involved, just hit me up. Check out the Discord. Yeah, it should be fun to kick off another tournament soon down the road. But yeah, thanks everyone for playing. Thanks everyone for watching the videos, and we'll see you next time. Bye.